So we had intended to have this a little more informal. It was supposed to be like an Oprah Winfrey talk show. So we'll try to do a little bit of that. And let me just move over to the mic here so I'm not just standing in front of all of you. And we're very pleased today to have members of each of the organizations that signed on to the Lancet commentary that you have in your pamphlet. And what we wanted to do is to start off with asking each of these representatives from the groups some questions about how they are going to be able to contribute to the work moving forward, starting at this high level as we move forward into the individual papers and technical discussion. So with us on this roundtable, we have Ambassador Louis CdeBaca, who's the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State and Ambassador at Large, the Office of Monitoring and Combating Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of State. We have Marcia Eugenio, Director of the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor and Human Trafficking at the Department of Labor. We have Alan Guttmacher, the Director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the National Institutes of Health. We have Robin Ikeda, the Deputy Director for Noncommunicable Diseases, Injury and Environmental Health at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We have Ambassador Susan Jacobs, the Special Advisor for Children's Issues, U.S. Department of State. We have Carolyn Ryan, the Director of Technical Leadership at the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator at the U.S. Department of State. And finally, we have Brian Samuels, the Commissioner for the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Quite a heavy lift up here for lots of very distinguished panels. I hope the floor doesn't collapse. This is a very important group of people that we want to protect. So let's start this session with just thinking about some of the lessons that we've been learning over the past. And I'd like to ask Caroline Ryan from PEPFAR a question about lessons that PEPFAR has been learning. So, as one of PEPFAR's real successes has been making HIV/AIDS services available for vulnerable and hard-to-reach populations. And children outside of family care are often hard for social welfare systems to reach. So what are some of the successful approaches used by PEPFAR to make HIV/AIDS services available to the most vulnerable populations that might help to inform their efforts to deliver services needed by children outside of family care?
Thank you for your question, Robert. So let me just start by giving a small introduction to PEPFAR. So PEPFAR is one of the largest, if not the largest, contributor to global health needs of vulnerable children. And in 2011, we reached 4.1 million orphans and vulnerable children across 26 countries. Our approach has been to strengthen families as the primary caregivers of children and support the commodities to create protective and caring environments, building on the capacity of the social service systems to protect the most vulnerable. We also allocate resources for children according to the needs and context of the HIV/AIDS environment. But looking at hard-to-reach children, we use the principle that we've been using for hard-to-reach populations. And that includes evidence-based, first incorporating evidence-based approaches to reach the really hard to define populations, then defining those populations so we can create programs for them, then integrating those services. So when a population is hard to reach, it's important to reach out to that population and to utilize services and maximize every interaction with this target beneficiary group. And the most efficient way to accomplish this is through integration of services to create a continuum of care, sort of a one-stop outreach to the difficult to reach, and then a one-stop shopping so that all services are provided for them. And then engage in policy and advocacy changes. Policies that are sensitive to hard-to-reach populations are critical for creating a framework for service delivery for these populations. We also understand what are the commitments of the barriers that can be dealt with in governments so that we can have countries engage on these issues towards country ownership. I'd just like to give you two quick examples. One is street children and childhood in households. And we've created extensive support for PEPFAR programs through USAID and Peace Corps. For example, USAID has funded a very successful mentoring program for youth and childhood households in Rwanda. And Peace Corps volunteers have supported housing construction, land retention, and acquisition for households in Botswana. And then in post-conflict situations, for example, the Peace Corps volunteers hosted a 7-day camp for 80 youth in post-conflict Uganda, many of whom were born in internally displaced camps. As much as 80% of the LRA forces were comprised of these abducted children. And these former soldiers face extreme hardships as they attempt to integrate to their families and their communities. The objective of the Peace Corps camp was to engender in the participants respect, compassion, the ability and the willingness to learn, and the skills needed to resolve difficulties through peaceful means along with HIV prevention. And some of the youth were to start peace clubs when they went back to their communities.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And I know you just got back from Ethiopia, so we appreciate you joining us. So we'd like to keep with this theme of lessons learned and move from the international to the domestic. So I'd like to ask Brian Samuels, what challenges to implementing evidence-based practices has HHS encountered with its domestic programs?
Sure. I will speak from the experience of both trying to implement a national home visiting model, as well as the work that we're doing around teen pregnancy prevention and trauma for children in the foster care system. I mean, I think when you look at the opportunity presented by evidence-based practice, it's undeniable that it's the direction that we need to go in. Going there through the initiatives that I've just described, we've identified two areas where there's a critical challenge as well as lessons learned. I think the first one really focuses on the training and capacity that frontline staff need to do this work. In almost every instance of an evidence-based strategy, there is a comprehensive set of skills and knowledge development that needs to occur, and that often means teaching those frontline workers new skills, different skills. It often means contradicting some of the things that they may have learned in their own graduate education or college education. And it also means ultimately challenging some professional values that place them in the perspective of being the expert. Much of this evidence-based practice really does challenge the frontline worker to engage with people as partners. And that takes an entirely different mindset than that of coming in and just saving folks, right? And so developing the capacity of frontline workers to implement these evidence-based strategies is certainly a challenge. It's one that we've learned some things on and we'll get better at. I can tell you from experience, when I was the chief of staff at the Chicago Public Schools, we implemented an evidence-based trauma-focused intervention specifically related to concerns around exposure to violence that children from the most violent communities were bringing with them to the school. During the 2.5 years I was there were almost 100 kids shot and killed, and about 600 that had just been shot but not killed. And so we wanted to be able to help the young people who were being exposed to all this really bad stuff. And one of the things that we discovered was that even training master's degree clinicians, social work clinicians in an evidence-based strategy and putting them in an environment where they could do this work was difficult. And we were struck by the slow pace at which that execution happened, and ultimately what we learned from sitting down and talking to these clinicians that were trained was, one, they were really concerned about Pandora's box. They were really concerned about if they opened up this box of engaging young people around issues of exposure to violence, that they could put all that stuff back in the box and send them back to class or send them home after a group session. So there was great anxiety there. There was a real professional commitment, but folks trying to figure out how to do that was pretty scary. And then the second thing we learned was how how often they had their own bad stuff that they had to deal with. And so this prospect of engaging young people on issues that were really critical to their mental health challenged them to have to deal with some of the things that they were carrying around with them. And so those were two really important barriers that we had to overcome if we were going to implement these evidence-based practices. So frontline training is a critical issue around implementation. And then the second place that I would argue is a challenge is around building the capacity of the model developers themselves. And often these evidence-based strategies have been implemented in a limited number of places in a very controlled manner. The folks that have designed and implemented these strategies often have had tight controls over who got in, how many services were provided, and how the money got spent. And as we then, at the federal government level, tried to pick up these evidence-based strategies and put them in multiple places all at the same time, it required that those model developers have the capacity to work in 50 states all at the same time, that they had the ability to train folks that they didn't pick themselves to be able to implement the strategies, and then to focus on the fidelity to implementation, making sure that the way it got done when it was experimented on and demonstrated to work also happened across the country. And so building their capacity to deal with those issues were critical. And then the last thing that I would point out related to the model developers and building capacity is really around cultural adaptation. You know, in these controlled environments, they targeted a pretty limited group of individuals. In the context of implementing an evidence-based strategy across the country, you will be dealing with a great deal of ethnicity, a great deal of diversity. And figuring out where the appropriate avenues are for adaptation so that the interventions really do fit with what folks have as an experience is a real challenge. And so, in summary, I would say, you know, in order to do this work right and to do it effectively, we have to have the capacity to train frontline workers and train them in ways that may be very different from their earlier development and training in school. And then second is really to be able to know who the designers are of these evidence-based strategies and work with them and their capacity so that you have the level of continuity and consistency necessary to expect reasonably to get the same results in very different environments from which they were evaluated.
Thank you, Brian. And it's clear that we can learn a lot from each other, both domestic and international. And thank you also for being part of the pre-summit, as well as sharing some of your impressions. I know you've also traveled to Ethiopia and experienced some of the issues in that country, and sharing from your perspective domestically and how that works has been very, very helpful to us. So thank you. I'd like to sort of follow up on one of the themes. We talked about violence a little bit. We've had a lot of focus in the last couple of weeks on gender-based violence. Certainly this is an area of importance in this field. And so Robin, Ikeda, I thought maybe you could share from CDC what's been known globally regarding the magnitude of violence against children's problems, and also describe whether evidence exists to demonstrate the type of interventions that should be most effective.
Sure, thank you. So currently, there's no worldwide system that exists to allow us to confidently estimate the magnitude of the problem of violence against children. And efforts to improve data are certainly needed. But however, I don't want to imply that there aren't any data, because we do have some information. And the information that we do have is quite sobering and disturbing. According to data published by the WHO World Health Organization, 57 homicide deaths occurred among children ages 0 to 14 in the year 2000. And of course, fatalities are just the tip of the iceberg. Non-fatal violence is harder to measure, although there are population surveys are one method that we can do this. And through a partnership known as Together for Girls, CDC, along with UNICEF, PEPFAR, other UN organizations, private organizations, and governments are working to address violence against children. And each country involved in the Together for Girls initiative conducts a national violence against children survey. And this information then allows estimation of the magnitude within that country. And the country can then use that information to mobilize support for prevention and response efforts. Tanzania is the most recent country to release a report, and the data indicate that violence against children in Tanzania is a very serious problem, with 1/3 of females and close to 15% of males aged age 13 to 24 report experiencing sexual violence before the age of 18. It's also important to note that violence against children can take many different forms, so not only sexual violence, but physical violence that is not of a sexual nature, as well as emotional violence. The other point that I wanted to make about the data are that the information from Tanzania are among children living within family care. We have, unfortunately, very little information about violence against children who are living outside of family care. And violence in these settings may be reported less frequently, making it very hard for us to estimate the magnitude. So this is certainly an area for future collaboration amongst all of us. In terms of effective interventions, again, I want to say at the outset that very few interventions have been rigorously evaluated. But again, it's not to say that we don't have any information about what works, as several interventions have been shown to be effective. Similar, though, to the issues with the data, the least is known about these most vulnerable children that are the focus of our discussion today. I'm going to mention just 4 sort of large buckets of types of interventions and strategies that we might want to consider as we move forward. And the first is taking evidence-based programs that have been designed for children living within family care and then adapt them to those children who are living outside of family care. So one example of this might be the PPP Positive Parenting Program, in which parents and caregivers. So one example here might be alcohol misuse is associated with a number of different types of violence, whether it's child maltreatment or youth violence. So policies that minimize alcohol misuse, whether it's taxes or limits on days and hours of sales, could help us prevent child maltreatment and youth violence. Third, it's important for us to really work with organizations that serve vulnerable children to develop prudent or best practices. So for example, one of the things that CDC has developed is a document about preventing child sexual abuse in youth-serving organizations. And this document provides guidance on things like screening and selecting employees and volunteers, monitoring behavior, and training on child sexual abuse prevention. These types of approaches have not been rigorously evaluated, but it is based in theory and has been described as prudent practice by experts in the field. And this approach seems particularly relevant for children who are outside family care, given that these individuals have much more or may have increased involvement in service entities. And then finally, and this has already been touched upon here in earlier remarks, improving the lives of children, vulnerable children, by preventing them from falling outside of family care in the first place. For example, in global HIV/AIDS efforts, we aim to keep children's parents healthy, alive, and productive through HIV prevention, care, and treatment so that these children don't become exploited and vulnerable. Just a few final thoughts. Partnerships and collaboration are certainly incredibly important to address violence against children. Just one concrete example, at CDC, the Division of Violence Prevention is responsible for our global violence prevention activities, including the Together for Girls initiative. And this division is a very small unit that has no global field staff. So we've been really fortunate to work with partners such as PEPFAR and UNICEF and able to leverage those partners' existing infrastructure and presence in country in order to access health systems data and also to reach people within the Ministry of Health and elsewhere. So the work of this division really could not be done without those connections and partnerships. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of work that can be done to improve the data collection, particularly violence against children for those living outside of family care. And as we move beyond documenting the magnitude of the problem and move into prevention efforts, the partnerships become even more important and necessary. We certainly need to be innovative and creative about how we leverage our expertise and our funds with other resources. And certainly I know this is a challenge given the financial environment that we're currently living in. So we look forward to working with all of you to continue our collective work. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you for sharing the work at CDC, and it really lays the background for the discussions over the next 2 days in terms of how some of the evidence stacks up on looking at this issue. In the case of trafficking in persons, crimes are a real challenge, and governments have a responsibility to address them as such. Criminals need to be prosecuted, and victims deserve justice. So I'd like to ask Ambassador CdeBaca, with your work in combating trafficking in persons, How can governments build capacity not only to protect vulnerable groups, but also to improve the way they respond to the crimes that victimize those groups?
Well, you're right that government action remains central to the struggle against trafficking persons, and I think, like Senator Landrieu, most of us hope that we would be able to go do what Liam Neeson pulled off in that movie. But unfortunately, many people don't know where their children are, they don't know what's happened to them, or they may think that the child is off working for the benefit of the family. The notion of the medicine that the mother needs, the roof over the house, or the books for the children. That notion of sacrificing yourself for your younger siblings is something that we see as we look at the cases that are happening around the world. It puts the children in a vulnerable position, and unfortunately, when there are vulnerable and alone children, there are often traffickers who would enslave them. I think that at the end of the day, while we need the structural protections, many of which we'll talk about over the next couple of days, many of which we see, whether it's in family law or labor law or other things like that, there are then some percentage of the situations that will unfortunately move over into full-blown enslavement of that child. And at that point, there's no question that governments have a responsibility to act through the criminal law. Now, in the last 10 years or so, through the promulgation of the Palermo Protocol at the United Nations system, we've seen over 130 countries having enacted new modern anti-trafficking laws. Not just ratifying the protocol, we've seen lots of conventions be ratified around the world, many not as fast as the Palermo Protocol, but you don't then necessarily see the changes in domestic law that follow it. And just so you know, when we're talking about trafficking, the U.S. government considers trafficking to be all of the activities involved in acquiring a person for or holding them in a condition of compelled service. So it's an umbrella term that we're talking about. It has a number of different crimes that one could name it within that umbrella term. Enacting laws isn't enough, and even though we've seen governments do this, progress has been too slow. We're talking about only about 4,000 prosecutions a year, convictions a year, for a crime that's victimizing, by some estimates, up to 27 million people. Now, I think one of the things, of course, is that we have to start stepping up and rejecting the notion that this is simply a cultural practice. There's case law in the United States going back to even the 1850s as we incorporated, as my family was incorporated into the U.S. And others with the Mexican territories. Cases saying just because it was okay to hold a child as a domestic servant because of a death that their parents or grandparents might have had before you were part of America. Now that you're part of America, we're going to stop this practice of peonage, stop this practice of what we would in the modern era call trafficking for death bondage of a child domestic servant. At the end of the day, that takes a specialized unit. It takes working with the NGO service providers to pursue cases in a way that focuses on the needs of the victim and the best interest of the child. It takes coordination across government. But at the end of the day, it also takes research. One of the things that we've realized, just like with violence against children, is that there is not a lot of great data out there. Most of the research money that we have and that we've been spending over the last decade in the modern fight against slavery has gone to what works or doesn't in shelter organizations, what's working with victim care and things like that. And it ends up not being as granular as one would like. This is not surprising, especially now, I think, in the last year, in the current budget cycle. We've been cut down to $16 million total for our foreign assistance funding. That's less than 75 cents per victim around the world. And so research actually probably becomes even more important. We're not necessarily going to be able to fund the shelters. We're not necessarily going to be able to fund specialized vetted police units and new child protective judges and things like that around the world. But research, I think, is going to be what we end up having to spend some of that money on. We have spent quite a bit over the years on research. We're looking right now, especially about this notion of the shelters and the for lack of a better word, almost orphanages that are being run by organizations all over the world are certainly the norm in human trafficking, and yet they aren't necessarily moving towards reunification. The other thing that we're looking at is as we talk to our other governmental counterparts, is the idea on victim care. You'll recall that the Palermo Protocol looks at the 3 Ps of prevention, protection, and prosecution. And at the end of the day, what we have to do is true victim care, not warehousing them for a while and then repatriating them back home to God knows what. But instead, we're encouraging other countries to do like the United States. Since 2000, we have had a T visa for trafficking victims, which allows parents of minor children to follow to join. And now actually allows their siblings to come along as well. So we can actually get the entire families here in the United States. We can get parents who have been enslaved in the United States to be able to bring their children as well. So this notion of family reunification as an integral part of victim protection, rather than simply warehousing and repatriating. And finally, I think one of the things that we're very much seeing, we're hoping that it will result in much more evidence, is as we incorporate, and I want to give a lot of credit to HHS for doing work on this over the last year or so, incorporating the anti-trafficking work into the work that CDF and others are doing. There is an assumption enshrined in many state laws around the country that child prostitutes are criminals. That there is such a thing as a child prostitute, as opposed to a victim. And I think that this is one of the things that we've had a very hard time being able to even sort out the data, to suss out the data. It maybe would have been better if trafficking was a new crime, because then we wouldn't have an overlay. But right now we have an overlay in the child protective system between a delinquent child, a child prostitute, a child drug addict. The family court judges see it one way, the child protective service system sees it another way. Federal law, federal anti-slavery law sees that child as a victim. And the 13th Amendment, like most constitutional prisons, should be trumping. So we have to go out and we have to continue to work on this. One of the best things that we've seen out there is this notion in Illinois that they've just done, which you can't actually close out your intake form as a child protective service worker without answering questions as to whether or not the child was trafficked. And I think that's actually a very low-cost alternative. But all of that is going to, I think, require a follow-on with contemporaneous data collection and analysis, because we're really at a point where there are good practices out there, whether they can be classified as best practices, promising practices, good, or any of the other classifications. Again, we're just not at that level of granularity, and we need to be.
Thank you, Ambassador, and also thanks for sharing your experience on this very important area of trafficking and bringing up this issue of the budget, because it's a backdrop to a lot of the work that we're doing, and I'm sure will be coming up as we look at step forward. You bring up the issue of research, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about research and asking Alan Guttmacher from NIH. From his perspective at NIH, what are the potential roles of research in developing research capacity in low and middle income countries towards better coordination and an interagency strategy to improve health and development outcomes in children in these areas? Alan.
Thank you, Oprah, for the question. The short answer to that, of course, is that this is that both research and developing the capacity in low and middle income countries to conduct that research are key if we're going to be effective in tackling the truly vital issues that we're here to consider. I'd also underline, though, that as the very title of the Lancet article states, that it's coordinated effort and also an evidence-based approach that really is important. You've heard that from some of the prior speakers as well. So clearly, from the NIH view, which is biased in favor of research, I have to admit we think that research in this is very important. Let me talk about this a little bit from both the NIH and NICHD approach. Of course, the NIH is about advancing our knowledge about health and disease. And very importantly, we're not the National Institutes of Biomedical Research, we're the National Institutes of Health, about applying that research in a way that really does improve health. At NICHD, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, we have the good fortune of, I hope it's probably being recorded, but I'll still say it, having the most important mission at the NIH. And as part of that, having a very broad mission, but in fact our very name, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Clearly the issues we're talking about today are core to our mission, have been since we were founded by President Kennedy 49 years ago. And I should also mention that we clearly take a broad view of what health means. Health is not the absence of disease. Health is well-being, really. And as we think about child health and human development, we have that broader kind of thinking about what it means. And also, we are interested not just in the health and well-being of children here in the U.S., but we are in fact interested in advancing the health and well-being of children globally. At NICHD alone, our international research portfolio includes roughly 1,000 different projects in over 100 countries. It includes biomedical, behavioral, social, epidemiologic, and demographic studies. And besides that sort of direct conducting and supporting of research, our other international activities include providing consultations, establishing lots of different kinds of partnerships, building research capacity. For instance, we've had a program which I think we're justifiably proud. It's now been on for over a decade in training research administrators in low and moderate income countries. Because in fact, if we're going to have good research capacity in such countries, it's not simply developing a cadre of researchers, it's not simply involving the population participatory research, but it's having people who are capable of administering that research in an effective way. So that's another way that we contribute to this. It's been interesting for me to think about the issues in this conference in the context we at NICHD for the last year or so have been having a scientific visioning process, looking across this, again, very broad mission we have, to try to identify what are the key scientific opportunities of the next 10 years or so. Figuring that 10 years is about as far out as we can go and be reality-based, which we want to be. At the same time, we want to push ourselves and push the field somewhat to be more ambitious, to be more coordinated in terms of what we do. And a number, this has been a series of lots of workshops, white papers, other kinds of things, over 500 folks from outside the NIH directly involved in this, a number of whom are in this room, looking at multiple kinds of issues. But among the areas that have come from that, which I think are particularly pertinent to this, are ideas about opportunities in the science of healthy development, including brain and behavior development, plasticity, regulatory skills, looking at the evolving concept of the modern family and what the impact on health and positive developmental outcomes throughout the lifespan is of that evolution of the concept of modern family. The importance of gene-environment interactions in child health and development. The developmental origins of health and well-being. This is a relatively new area of science where we think we now have the tools to really realize the fact that the child is father of a man and mother of a woman. The idea that we've often had that somehow if you just survive childhood relatively unscathed, that suddenly at the age of 21 you are given a new health passport for this new world or something. That's not the way it works. That in fact, early development, and not just in childhood, but even in fetal existence, both biologically and socially, has a large role to play in what adult health and well-being is like. And that again, we have new tools to be able to look at this, things like the genome sequence we've never had before. So that this is an area that's really rich for good exploration and research. The impact of the social environment, culture, and such changes in the social environment as global urbanization. What do they have on child health and human development? More specifically, in terms of the social environment, looking at the impact of stress and trauma on development, looking at secure attachments, looking at both typically developing children and atypically developing children to see how those play a role. We clearly also explore the reciprocity between basic science and applied work, which is essential for effective programs, but in an underdeveloped area. We spent a long time talking about more effective early intervention approaches, realizing that there's particularly large bang, we think, for the buck in early intervention approaches. And clearly, looking across this large landscape that is our mission area, it really underscored the importance of implementation science, not simply doing things, and it's, of course, all the partners here are aware of this. We need to no longer do things because they seem like the right thing to do, because they make us feel good. We need to do things which we can use evidence to demonstrate really have the desired impacts and outcomes. We are developing a vision statement from this process that we hope to be published in a leading scientific journal early next year. We hope that it will stimulate both thinking and some very good research. If you'd like to see various parts of what we're developing, just go to the NICHD website and there's lots of information about this. So let me conclude by emphasizing that continued progress truly does rely on multidisciplinary collaborations. That, in fact, was the major theme that came out of this whole scientific dictionary process, that multidisciplinary collaborations, for many, many reasons, are the best. None of us can do this alone. We need the kinds of partners that you see in this room if we're going to both build the evidence base and apply it for the kinds of issues that we're here to consider over the next couple of days. And we need very much to do that research in the communities where these children live. Community-based approaches lead to more effective research and interventions, and also, of course, increased sustainability. So we look forward very much to some good guidance from this summit as to how best to develop that evidence base and how to use that to inform U.S. governmental programs and policies to improve children's health and well-being. So thanks to all of you for being here, and importantly for the work that you all do.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for highlighting the spirit of partnership, which is essential as we move forward, and certainly as represented by all of you on the podium here. And also this importance of what happens in the fetal and the child to adults. I think that's clearly research has been putting more evidence out on that effect. And then finally, just for NIH for help for hosting the pre-summit, which actually provided a lot of input to this meeting today. So thanks very much. I'd like to keep on this theme of research and throw in evaluation and ask Marcia, Eugenio, how does the Department of Labor Bureau for International Labor Affairs work on research and evaluation to further the U.S. government's commitment to protect children outside of family care?
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And I just want to reassure Senator Landrieu that I'm one of those that calls my mother every day. We speak for only 2 minutes, but I make that phone call every day. Thank you for inviting the Department of Labor to participate in this panel. We have spent a great number of years looking at one particular issue, and that's the issue of international child labor. And as many of you have mentioned, and it was mentioned by Senator Landrieu, that we don't know the magnitude of the problem. In many cases, we don't know the magnitude of how many children are engaged in trafficking, or how many children are actually working on the worst forms of child labor, or how many children are outside of protective family care. And I want to mention that protective family care. So one of the things that we have invested a lot of resources and effort is in building the capacity, a global capacity to conduct research on the issue of child labor, but also building the national capacity to do so as well. And I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the global context, but also the national context, and talk a little bit about research in the sense of impact evaluations and what that tells us and how that helps build programs and policies that actually deal with the root causes of the problem rather than just the consequence or the impact of the problem. So the Department of Labor has worked in over 25 congressionally mandated reports on international child labor and forced labor issues. And we've also worked with the International Labor Organization in conducting global research on this issue, and helped the international organization actually build a statistical program to actually do so. We have, this has become in a way the cornerstone of the work that we do in my office. And since before 1995, there were no global estimates about the worsening to child labor or even child labor itself. The International Labor Organization in 1995 actually produced the first estimates of child labor, indicating that there were about 200 million children working around the world under the age of 15. That global estimate actually had a great deal of impact. It was one of the first times that countries actually could discuss the issue around a specific number and the magnitude of the problem. And it led actually to the adoption, the universal adoption of Convention 182 on the worsening of child labor, which is one of the most ratified conventions that the International Labor Organization actually has. Since 2000, we have been funding every 4 years, about 2000, 2004, 2008, global estimates on child labor. And one of the things that those estimates is showing is that the number of child labor is actually going down. So the last estimates that we have from the ILO actually show that about 250 million children are working. Now, we all rejoice because it demonstrates that there is a decrease in the number, but one of the things that the information is actually telling us is that also the number of children working in sub-Saharan Africa is increasing. So that actually was very useful for us because as we can see downward trends in other regions, we actually saw in Africa that it was increasing. And it actually kind of got us to focus our attention where the problem actually is and where the most need is. And one of the things that we were focusing on was this, in particular, and this is where it's relevant to this discussion that we're having, is sort of where was most of the children working? And a lot of these children are working in domestic service. As Ambassador CdeBaca mentioned, a lot of these children are in third-party homes. They are not in a protected family environment. Even though they actually happen to be residing in a family, they're not part of that family. They're the ones who are being abused, both physically and sexually in many cases, and are the most vulnerable to exploitation. So having this data actually helps us to target the limited resources that we have in trying to address the problem. At the national level, one of the things that we've been doing is also how the collection of data has helped, is we've been working with the implementation of the Hark and Engel protocol to basically address child labor in the cocoa supply sector in West Africa. And this includes a lot of children outside of family care because many of the children that were working in cocoa farms in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are actually being trafficked into those situations. So that public-private initiative actually has helped to focus attention on the issue, to reach agreement on the need for research, for information exchanges, for independent monitoring, and for public reporting on the issues. We've collected a lot of data on this issue, and from 2006 to 2010, we understand that there are about 1.8 million children working in cocoa farming in West Africa. And the other interesting data point that came out of that is that about only 3% of those children were actually receiving remediation service, so service related to going to school, to vocational training, to health services. Again, that was a call for action. It kind of rallied everyone around the issue that now we have not only the magnitude or some rough estimate of the magnitude of the problem, but the fact that many children were actually not receiving services. And there was a new declaration that came out in 2010 to support the Hark and Engel protocol, and it called for more focus on that. One of the other interesting factor that came out of this is that the government of Ghana, as a result of the data that was collected, determined that children working with machetes in cocoa farm was actually a hazard. So they included that in their hazardous list. So this is where having that little piece of information that you get from research actually leads to very concrete action that can have an impact on addressing the problem. I just want to say a few words about evaluation because it's something that we are happy, I should say, that we're actually getting a little bit more engaged, not just in conducting evaluation in the sense is our taxpayers' money actually going for their intended purposes, but are the actions and the strategies that we're funding the most effective and have the greater impact in achieving the goals that we are trying to achieve. And we've been funding impact evaluation of a number of our projects and using randomized controlled trials. And the difference in doing impact evaluations is really important for us because we have been looking at the issue of how to address the worsening of child labor from a very comprehensive way in trying to address do we need to do awareness raising, do we need to do monitoring, do we need to provide children with education, provide their families with livelihoods. But we don't know which one of those or the combination of those strategies actually has the greater impact. So what we're trying to do is say, is the independent monitoring, is the community monitoring, does that have a real big impact, all things being considered, as opposed to just doing awareness raising? And we're funding these projects in Bolivia, in Egypt, in El Salvador, in Ghana, the Philippines, and Thailand, and we're hoping that in a year or two we'll be able to share with all of you the results of this research, because we believe that it's going to take the conversation as to what works and under what conditions to a different level in terms of this particular issue. I just want to conclude by thanking everyone who has been working on the PL 109 group, because I know that this is an important issue that perhaps doesn't get all the attention that it deserves, and everyone who is in this room and everyone who works on this issue actually deserves a lot of gratitude in the sense of being able to spend time on children that do not really have a voice. And you're providing them with that voice by actually working on this and by publishing this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for showing us how data can really influence policy, something that's very important for our work today, as well as the importance of evaluation and making sure that we're able to tell the story and track progress. So to round up the panel, I'll ask Ambassador Susan Jacobs about the State Department. In the Lancet article, there's discussion of a unified U.S. government response to children living outside of family care. What role will the State Department Office of Children's Issues play in this interagency strategy?
Thank you, Robert. And thank all of you for being here today. I think this is a really important meeting, and I'm looking forward to further discussions. At the Office of Children's Issues at the Department of State, we believe that our contribution to the work of the PL 10995 Secretariat in promoting children's rights is to promote practices and policies through our diplomatic efforts around the world that protect all children. We have a special role because we are the central authority for the Hague Conventions on Adoptions and Abductions. And so our focus is to make these conventions effective tools for protecting children. And through the interagency efforts, we believe that will be the key to our success. Through the coordination provided by the PL 10995 Secretariat, we can strengthen child welfare systems around the globe, protect children, and thus give children the opportunity to grow in safe, permanent families. At a time when resources are limited, our diplomatic efforts, harnessed with the work of others, many of you who are in the room today, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and the agencies represented at this table, can be force multipliers that create and promote policies and provide services that help children and families. So our challenge is to continue to coordinate our efforts to assist countries to create effective child welfare and protection systems that benefit all vulnerable children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Jacobs. And I just want to thank all of the panelists here. When we first talked about this session, I had these visions of these boring people getting up and having speech after speech after speech. So, I said, well, let's make it lively. Let's have some questions. And first, I'd like to thank your staff who actually came up with the questions. And I think it shows this very close-knit interagency process of people knowing each other, working with each other over the years, and really being able to hone in on what are the key issues and working with you and your responses and being able to share that with us as a group. So thank you for being concise, for being informative, and also showing your passion. Because I think that's something that we've heard about in the other sessions. We all have this passion for this issue, and it's nice to see such senior leaders also sharing this and being able to be a force to apply your wisdom and skills to this issue. So thank you very much.